we're going to look at the second half of Romans chapter 1 today. Something I want to say about yesterday, we learned about Apostle Paul and who he was. He was, frankly, a genius of his era, someone with very smart, very knowledgeable about what is good and what is bad, someone with really great ability, in fact. But he found out he wasn't right with God. He found out he wasn't right with God. He came to that realization. And he came to realize that the starting point of being right with God isn't our own ability, isn't his force of his mind and his power in order to know what was right and do what was right. But he came to know that the starting point is faith, right? Opening up our hearts with faith. And that's something I want to say to all of you too before we begin, that really, when it comes to knowing the Word of God, when it comes to doing God's will and everything about Him, it's very often, especially in this country, we tend to focus on those outward things or ability, those categories that Apostle Paul had. Apostle Paul was a genius. Apostle Paul did know what was good and what was bad. He was a Jew of Jews. He did have great abilities, right? And because of that, if we don't have that, then maybe we can feel less confident. But what we come to find out is that God, who does God go to? God doesn't go to the ones with great abilities. He went to the sinners. Jesus went to the sinners, the tax collectors and the prostitutes. He went to the ones that have the empty heart. And so when it comes down to it, when it comes to faith, right, when it comes to this walk of faith, more than this country which, keeps on speaking about what you have to do outwardly and your abilities and all those things, better is the one who is more humble and empty inside of the heart. That's the starting point for faith. That is the starting point for doing God's will. So it's a good message to any of us who have an empty heart, who have a willing heart, who may not have all those abilities on the outside. Be more confident, because that's actually the starting point where God can work with us more. And God considers that more preciously than the one that has great abilities, like we see in this country. And so we're going to take a look at that theme a bit more as we take a look at this second half of Romans. So let's look in Romans chapter 1 from verse 18 through 20. We're going to start there. Romans chapter 1 in verse 18 through 20. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So it says something interesting here. Rather than the godless and, there are these people, there are the godless and wicked people. And Paul is saying that about us, that, when we're not right with God, this is what happens to us. We're godless and wicked people. We're suppressing the truth of God by our wickedness. We're denying him, right? We're denying that he even exists, even though God's existence is obvious. So who is Paul talking about? So Paul, when he's who's he talking to here? He's talking about us. He's talking and he's writing to Rome, the powerful nation, and which we said yesterday is America now, right? This is the message to America now. So as you read this, do you really feel this, that Paul is talking about the problem that we have in America today, right? That everything should look good, materialistically wealthy, we're confident in ourselves. There's people here in this country that have such great ability and great power, and they're doing really well. I live here in San Francisco in Silicon Valley. You wouldn't believe the housing prices here. I mean, it's insane how much a house costs here. Pastor Aaron would know, you're from here originally, so you know how insane it can get here. but then people still somehow come up with the money, and they do that. There's people that do these things, and they have, there's so much wealth in this area, and I'm sure you guys know it too. Just looking around the country as you look at the news, there's so much wealth in it, but people are still in despair and anxiety. So, there, it's like this dichotomy here. On one hand, people, we should have everything we need. We're materialistic wealthy and we have everything we need. But on the other hand, we still have our despair and anxiety. We have an opioid crisis here in this country where people are just taking drugs all the time in order to feel good about themselves, because they feel wrong all the time. They're missing something. And so, there's sickness. There's a sickness in this country, right? Where there is a part of it that just isn't right. Right? And Paul felt this sickness in him, and he felt it even in the people of the Rome at the time, that they just aren't right with God. Right? We're godless. This country is a country that is godless and wicked, suppressing the truth of God, denying that he even exists. We recall yesterday there was a verse in the Bible that said in verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." So if you look in Rome and you look at America today, in America today, we have this sickness inside of us where so many people are in despair and in anxiety and just not right. Even though it seems like everything should be right, things just aren't right. And what is the core problem in this country? What is the core problem that Paul's pointing out here? It's that we live in a country that is godless. People are suppressing the truth of God, denying that he's even there. Right? I mentioned verse 16 where it said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel." We have people that are ashamed to even be Christians, even. Or maybe not that as much, maybe as perhaps more as people shaming Christians. You look in any news article and you go down to the comments, and then what do you see? People, talking about, how can you believe in God? How can you believe in Christianity? And then, they putting down Christians, and there is this shame. Really, there is this shame, and so we live in a country that is godless and wicked, and Paul's pointing out that root, that is the root. That's why even those on the outwardly, we should have all the categories. People are so materialistically wealthy. They have abilities, but that's not it. Paul had all the ability in the world. He was a genius, but he still felt wrong. And that's what we've got to know too, that we can still feel wrong. Even if we've got all the categories and classifications set properly, we can still feel wrong if we don't have God. Now, the philosopher Pascal, he had what we call the betting theory. Blaise Pascal was his name. He was a philosopher back in the day, and he had the betting theory. So his theory was basically, are you willing to wager your eternity that God doesn't actually exist? Are you willing to wager that? So people, they think only about their life here on earth, but then forget about the whole eternity. But then believing that God doesn't exist, we may be betting our whole eternity by betting that God doesn't exist. So, on bets, there's like two sides of things, right? So you better take the more favorable odds. Well, in eternity, we're going to bet our entire eternity that God isn't there. And so, he had this kind of theory about that. So, Paul is saying that about this, that the wrath of God is being revealed to the ones that are godless and wicked, even those God's plain existence is obvious. Now, think about it this way. The building that you guys are all in right now, the house or apartment that you're all in right now, did it just appear randomly? Did it just, appear out of thin air? This is not possible, right? You don't know who the builder was. You don't know who constructed your building, but you know that someone did construct it, right? There's 0% chance that it just appeared randomly. There was a builder. So, you take the same thing and you talk about the whole creation of the world. What do you mean that there is no God? This country, this philosophy in this country, which says, that everything just appeared randomly. Is that really what we want to think, that it just all appeared randomly? So here, that's what Paul's saying. He's saying that if you look at the beautiful world that we are in, you go to Nearby here in California, we have Yosemite. And you just enter Yosemite. It's just kind of like mountain roads at first, but then you make a turn and then you see this wide ranging scenery of Yosemite. And it's so beautiful. And are you saying that that beautiful scenery was just created randomly? You look at it and you've got to admit there's a painter. There was a painter behind all of this. It's so beautiful how it is. And then even sustaining this world, the fact that we wake up tomorrow, we go to sleep and then we have faith that we're going to wake up tomorrow and the world is just not going to explode. Why is that? It's because, there is a God, and at a fundamental level inside of us, we believe that there is a God. Not only did he build this world, but he is sustaining this world now. And that when we wake up, this world is still going to be here. And at a fundamental level, we all have this kind of faith inside of us. So the fact that this universe was created, the fact that the universe still continues to exist, and this whole world exists, now how can we deny that God doesn't exist? It's ridiculous, really, to deny God. But when you look out in the news and you go, down to the articles and to the comments about people who talk about Christianity, who talk about the Bible, talk about God, they say they deny God, saying, how can you believe in God? The fact is that we're too full of ourselves in America. It's all about me, me, me. You look at everything out there, all our social media, go on Facebook, everything out there is me, me, me. We're very self-centered. We're very full of ourselves, but we're bankrupt of God. We're godless, wicked, and denying God all the time. This is the problem. This is the problem that Apostle Paul is speaking about here. So, the truth is, whether we look on the outside at the creation, there is that where we can acknowledge the creation, acknowledge that there is a creator based on the creation. But even there's something else we need to know. Even on the inside, our hearts actually know that there is a God. There is an intuition inside of us. No matter how much we deny intellectually, like with our head, we try to rationalize whether God exists or doesn't exist. We can rationalize this way and balance things this way and that way intellectually. But there's also something in the heart which knows that there is a God. It's like the sunflower always faces the sun, right? That's how it is. It has an intuition almost inside of it. That's how it was created. The Bible has a verse where it talks about the deer panting for water. The deer always goes towards the water. Animals have an intuition. The birds know how to fly. They know where to go. We too have an intuition inside of us. We have a spirit longing for God above us. And we know that we, in ourselves, in our bodies and in ourselves, we feel stuffy, that we're limited and we're stuffy. And there is something beyond this. Actually, this is something we need to know. This is a core basic principle of Christianity. It's that we are limited. We're limited. We're physically limited, right? There's only so much I can do, right? If you ever to try to race Usain Bolt, could you ever beat him? You couldn't, right? There's just no way. He's just physically that much more. If we even spent our whole lives, there's no way we could beat him. And there's physical limitations to us. There's things we can do and there's things we can't do. So, what it is, this principle, and what this is talking about is that we are in a prison of finitude. What that means is that when it comes to my body and my mind and my thoughts, we are limited in a certain finite existence. It's that God is the creator, right? That's what we need to know. This is what Paul's talking about here. He's talking about the creator and he's talking about the creation. So God is the creator, and then there's this gap, and we are the creation, right? We're the creation. And the creation, we as the creation, were created in a finite existence. So it means that no matter what we do, we cannot go to God in the infinite existence. We are down here. And so our minds can even only go so far, right? It's because it's limited. Because we were created in this reality, in this finite time and space, right? This reality that we were created in is a reality of time and space, but God is beyond that, right? God transcends beyond that. He transcends beyond, he is above time and above space. He is eternal. right? He is the God above us. But we were created in this reality, right? And so when it comes to our minds about what we can think and what we can do, there's a physical limitation that we have. There's a mental limitation that we have. Physically and mentally, I'm limited. And God is beyond that. So think about it this way. No matter how much I try to think about God, there's no way I can conceive him at all, right? I can know him. I can know him by the creation, and I can know him by certain other attributes. And you know, in the Bible, it says, for example, we are created in the image of God, and there's ways that we can know God, but ultimately we need to know that there's a gap, that I am limited. I only can go so far with my physical and mental ability, but God is infinite. He is way above us. So since we are in this prison of finitude, and God is eternal above us, can we go to him? In fact, we can't, right? This is the basic principle that we learn in the Bible and Christianity, and this is what Apostle Paul is talking about here. Because there's a gap, because our finite existence in our physical body and our mental capacity can only go up so far, we cannot reach the infinite God. There's this gap that we cannot cross over to get to him, right? We cannot go to him completely. So, you know, of course, there are things we can do. We can study the word, we can study the Bible, we can do many things in order to step by step. And this helps. I'm not saying it doesn't help. We should do these things. We should study the Bible more, and we should do these things, and it does help. But what we need to know that it is ultimately limited. And there is that gap between us and God. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 in verse 25 and 26, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 in verse 25 and 26. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. So here it's saying that the foolishness of God, there's this gap. So even God is way up here, and even his foolishness is higher than man's wisdom. So, you know, in actuality, this teaches us something completely different. It flips around our thinking completely. So for us, in living in this world, especially living in this country in America, we try so hard to be smart ones, be full of ourselves, try to progressively get this intellect in order to try to reach the infinity. But what we need to know is that there's no way in actuality. You know, there's always going to be that gap. Right? There's always going to be that gap. We're physically and mentally limited. And so in actuality, it's a hindrance. It's a hindrance being too smart, too full of oneself. You know, 1 Corinthians in chapter 1, if you read about this rest of this chapter, what it talks about is even a stumbling block. For the people who are too smart and too full of themselves, it's a stumbling block to get to know God. Because why? So, you know, we can try to progressively go up to God, but we're going to always hit that limit, right? We're always going to hit that limit. So since we cannot go to God, you know, what must happen instead? Is that the infinite God must come down to us, right? That's the only way. Since we are limited and we cannot go up to God, the infinite God must come down to us. So what is the principle of faith? The principle of faith is transcendently receiving from above, right? That's what I call what faith is. This is a discussion we were having yesterday even too, and when Mihi sort of reflected in that way. She talked about how, you know, it's really when she empties herself and repents before God, and then that's when, you know, she can build up more trust and faith and determination in God. It's that's actually the starting point of faith. Right? The later stuff, the trusting in God, all those other things start from that point. It's transcendently receiving. Right? That's when faith starts. It's when I put down myself, repent, and present myself to God. And then instead of trying to go up to God, it's putting open my heart and receiving from him. That's what we call faith. So in fact, faith is not mental power. You know, faith is not determination and holding on. Sometimes we have that kind of atmosphere, like we admire, the people who, you know, have some mental determination and keep holding on, you know, really trust in God all the way. and we look at that powerfully. But when you look, in fact, that of course, all that is good. I'm not saying that none of that is good. That is all good. But what you come to find is that is a consequence of this first part. And what God looks at more is this first part, is this transcendent receiving from him. When we receive power from him, when we open up our heart to him and we bathe in God's warm grace, this is when the word can come really deeply into me. Right? That's how it always is. The word touches me in hidden place in the spirit, and I understand. It doesn't hit me mentally, but it hits me here in the spirit, inside of the soul. And so really, I wish we can look with some faith and hope in that. Paul's saying, we weren't of noble birth by human standards. We weren't influential. There may not be all these categories in us, but the one who has an empty and humble heart, that is the one who God gives graciously. And I wish we can be these ones. So I'll stop there. Let you guys, rather than a discussion question, how about I just let you guys reflect at all? Any questions, any thoughts you have on this section of this slide? Let's continue on to the next set of passages. Let's look at Romans chapter 1, and we'll look from verse 21 through 27. Romans chapter 1 in verse 21 through 27. So for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity and for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to the shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. So our hearts he's talking about our hearts becoming darkened. And why does that happen? Well, instead of receiving from the Creator God, I've emphasized that continuously because this is what Paul's emphasizing. We need to really receive from the Creator God, but instead of receiving from him, we're exchanging God for idols. Right? We're doing the complete opposite. We're exchanging God from idols. And what do we do when we're worshiping idols? So you might think, I don't worship idols, but in actuality, we do. We do worship idols. What are idols? Idols are created things. So I may not be like creating an object and then saying that's God, like you see in the Bible, like worshiping idols. But what it's talking about is worshiping created things. Money, sex, fame. All of these things are things that we as mankind have created. This is modern idol worshiping here in America. So we all do that. We worship so many fake things, so many temporary things that we created, and then we worship them. But does that really make any sense at all? We're worshiping things that we created. It's like the things that we created, are we going to find more eternity and more value in them? We aren't, right? We aren't going to find more depth in them. It is the Creator God who is above us. Right? There's a gap. There's God and then there's us and there's a gap between us. And we're limited, right? And when we create things and we're worshiping things that we're creating, we're just circling around down here. And so we must not fall into that. We must not fall into the things that we worship, but we must worship God. And so what happens though? When we start worshiping the created things, when we're down here just worshiping our created things and getting stuck in those things, what happens? It says God gave them over to their sinful desires. That's verse 24. And in verse 26, because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lust. So desires, all these things that we're getting locked into when it comes to idolatry, the money, sex, fame, whatever it is, all the things that we're getting locked to in the idolatry. It says God gave us over to that. Right? And you might think, what do you mean? Does God really abandon us like this? Shouldn't God just hold on to us? But actually, when you come to look at it, why is it that God gives us over in that way? It's because we find out that God is love. And love is not forced, right? Love is not a forced thing, right? You cannot take a knife to someone and say, love me, right? That's not true love. There's not the free will inside of their heart. So if by our will we are turning away from God into ourselves and into created things, then God has no choice but to let us go. And that might sound good, right? That might sound good that, oh, we're free and we were free to do whatever we want then. If you look in America, we're founded on this foundation of freedom. We have freedom here in this country. In fact, the Pilgrims originally left Europe for religious freedom. So there's good aspects about freedom, having freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of media. These are things we have here in America that many, many other people don't have. But there is something we need to know about freedom, that there is such thing as good freedom and bad freedom. So what is good freedom? If you look in John chapter 8 in verse 32, John chapter 8 and verse 32, it says, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." So it's that there is good freedom. There is good freedom when it comes to being in God, right? For good, holy things. That is good freedom to have. But how about freedom without God? What we need to know is that this is bad freedom, right? This is bad freedom. And you might think, especially in this country where, we like freedom a lot and freedom is good. We might think, can there be such thing as bad freedom? But it's true, there is something like that. Freedom to sin is not, freedom and sinning inside, using our freedom to sin is not good freedom at all. And we must have discipline. We need God's rule and law. We must have discipline in order to have true freedom. This is a principle that the Bible teaches us, that God's rule and law, right, being within God, being disciplined in God, this is actually what allows us true freedom. So let's put it this way, athletes, all athletes have like a natural ability, right? But some of them become, elite athletes, the LeBron Jameses of the world or the Steph Currys of the world, these kind of people. And how do they become these elite athletes? Well, a lot of these pro athletes, they all have they have this elite ability, but to become the elite of the elite, the top, a lot of them work really hard. They have rule and discipline, what to eat, how to train, they shoot so many shots. And what this does is it actually frees the potential inside of them. The discipline, by having discipline, it frees the potential inside of them. Isn't that true? I mean, in order to be free, it's like this. It's like you can't just eat all the time. If you eat all the time and then you get fat, and then you can't really move that well, right? And so you need to really diet and discipline yourself and not gain weight. And then that's when, life is easier. You can move a bit more freely. And so there's something like this in God also when it comes to freedom, right? That true freedom, the principle of the Bible is that true freedom comes with rule and discipline, right? We need to do the things that we need to do, right, in God. So coming to church, for example, I want to encourage that to the both of you, Justin and Roy, to really come and join our services, join our church. That's this is part of it. God wishes for us to worship Him on the Sabbath day, on Sunday, on the holy day. And when we have when we keep these things, right? When we keep these things, prayer time, pray before we eat, go to church on Sunday. Some of our church members, we pray before we drive even, God, please protect me before I drive so I won't get in an accident and maybe I won't get a ticket either. These rules, as we keep these things in faith, they actually give us true freedom. They keep us, right? They allow us to feel true freedom inside of our spirits. Because on the other hand, if you look 2 verses down from the verse that we just read, John chapter 8 and verse 34, John chapter 8 and verse 34, it says, Jesus replied, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin." In actuality, sin keeps us a slave to sin. It's counterintuitive, but it's true. This kind of freedom is not freedom at all. Freedom to sin, right? Freedom to sin, being in sin, is not freedom at all. It just makes me a slave to sin. And I'm using instead freedom to make an excuse for myself, to self-justify myself so I can keep on sinning. So stop there. I'll let you guys reflect on any of those points from the previous slide. We're running out of time. I'm going to try to continue on and finish up this last slide here. So we're going to read Romans chapter 1 in verse 27 through 32. Romans chapter 1 in verse 27 through 32. It says, I got that wrong. It's verse 28. From verse 28, it says, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them. So Paul's saying, look around you and look at ourselves. We are godless and we're falling into this list of sin, list of godlessness, spiraling down into that. So how is modern life? Or philosophy in modern life is really about finding ourselves, being self-reliant, becoming mature on our own. And even in this country, we lift up the people who are self-reliant, are mature, and we lift up these kind of people thinking they are great people. But when you come to see it, it's a godless life, really. It's a godless life, finding my own way on my own, relying on myself and doing things on my own. There is no God. You know, I mean, when you really think about it, can I just rely on myself? I can't. That's what we came to learn in the first section, that we are weak and we are limited. Right? And in the second section, that we will inevitably fall into sin, right? We are slave to sin, and on our own, we are weak and we are limited. We are down here. We are not the infinite God. We're down here limited in the flesh, and we're always going to fall into the sin. And so look at the sin. Look how much the bottom falls out when we don't have God, when we're left to our own desires. Evil, greed, hating parents, no mercy, no love. If you look at this list, we're not being honest with ourselves if we say we don't have one or many of these sins. We have to be honest with ourselves. I am a sinner, right? I am a sinner. You know, we shouldn't think that I'm not a sinner. This is sin that I have inside of me. And so, but what is the problem? You know, what is the problem? It's that we reject being a sinner. We don't want to admit it. We don't want to repent. Right? We're too self-righteous in ourselves. And the whole modern philosophy, the whole of America is about this self-righteousness. Modern life has made us that way. And we revere people who are so confident and so, you know, we look up to those people who are so confident and do things on their own, and people who are able to self-justify, who are so intelligent in that way, and and then because of that, we ourselves try to copy that. And then we also reject being a sinner. We just become, you know what the problem with self-righteousness is? The problem with self-righteousness is that self-righteousness, or pride and self-righteousness, makes us blind to our own self-righteousness and pride. That's the problem with it. You know, when you're prideful and when you're self-righteous, you can't even see your own self-righteousness and pride to begin with, right? It's like this never-ending loop. It's this never-ending paradox that you're in. We're stuck in this impossible cycle. I'm blind to it. And that's the root of it in actuality. That's the root of it. That's exactly why I don't feel right all the time. Because I'm too prideful. I'm trying on my own ability and my own power. I'm too much into myself. I'm too much into what I need to do, right? I need to do this and I need to do that. And when I do this and when I do that, then I can be right with God. And then all that does is get us impossibly stuck in this situation. But here's what we need to know about the gospel and what the gospel teaches us. That is exactly the point in actuality. It's that we can't do anything. We can't do anything about it. There is this gap. We are limited. And because we are limited, there's actually nothing I can do about it. I am too weak and I am too limited. There's no way, no matter how hard I try, I can't close that gap. I cannot close that gap to go to God. And so instead, that is why God has to come to us. The core verse we read last time, the righteous will live by faith, in verse 17. The righteous will live by faith. So it's not that I somehow close the gap and become righteous, but God comes to me, right? God's righteousness comes to me. He allows me to be right when I have faith in Jesus Christ. It's when I open up my heart to Jesus, he gives us. It's not about me coming up there and doing it. It's about him giving it to me. He gives us the righteousness by faith. You know, earlier I said God led us free, right? When we left him, God gave us over. And then we might think, and then we thought, oh, why did God abandon us? But in actuality, he didn't abandon us. But he also didn't come to us in a forced way. He didn't come and say, hold us by our necks and say, you have to believe in Jesus. He didn't do it that way. Instead, he came to us in a manger in Jesus, who showed us with his entire life what love is. And he gave us that love on the cross. And that was the deep realization of Paul. Paul, who he himself tried everything under his genius ability and power to get up to God, but was never able to become right in that way. He failed to do so. But it was only when Jesus came to him in the desert being blinded. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Jesus came to him in a personal encounter. And when that full and amazing transcendent grace of God that comes from above, because we can't reach it, when that transcendent grace came down to him, that's when he became convicted of his sin and his own self-righteousness. He was so self-righteous before, thinking about his way of going to God. But he realized it's not about that. It's about God coming to me. And in actuality, we come to see that that is the only solution to pride and self-righteousness. Pride and overcoming pride and self-righteousness is not about what I need to do to become more humble. Right? It's not even about any of that. Right? If I try my hardest to become more humble, then I'm just going to fail. Right? That's not actually the way to do it. What is the way in which Jesus showed us? He came to Paul. When overwhelming grace came to him, right? The more and more we try to, overcome our pride, we're just self-righteous. Self-righteousness makes us blind to self-righteousness. So no matter what, we're going to be stuck in this loop. Right? We're always going to be stuck into this loop. But when grace pours down from above on us, that's what convicts us of our own self-righteousness. It's like so counterintuitive, but it's true. When grace comes into our life, it convicts me, then I open my eyes to my own self-righteousness. That's actually the only way to open our eyes to our own pride and self-righteousness. It's when I receive grace. And when I receive grace, that's the starting point to repenting, turning back, and receiving God. And so here you can see Apostle Paul, he's talking about all the same things here. That is what faith is. And I really want to emphasize this, especially as I'm hearing you guys, give some feedback on your path of faith. I feel you guys. Trust me, I feel you guys in terms of how hard life is and how hard the rat race of this world is. The gospel teaches us something completely different from the world. It's all about receiving first. That's the core of everything. We have not received, we cannot give, and we cannot do anything. And so I pray that we can be the ones that this becomes a starting point for us in faith, to receive God through the grace that he gave us through his son, Jesus Christ. I wish we can be these ones. So definitely out of time here. Just wrap up. Any last comments? Justin or Roy, let you guys start. Any last questions, any last comments, anything about pride and self-righteousness that maybe hit you in any way?